how to measure cyber risks. Like any risk measurement, we need to apply a model and make some assumptions about the way we view the risk. The model often used is FAIR, which stands for Factual Analysis of Information Risk. For those of you who already know this model and might even used it in the past, I should make two disclaimers. The first disclaimer is that the model uses some fancy words like loss frequency and loss magnitude. I will replace those terms with simpler terms just for the sake of simplicity, but you should know that I refer to the same things. The second disclaimer is that in the core of the model lies the concept of breaking down the risk into sub-elements. The model tends to go above and beyond in the methods of the breakdown, which is a level of complexity I could not go into in the limits of this video. Thus, I will now cover the entire breakdown system, but only touch upon the pieces I think are most relevant. So let's begin. The model starts with the basic formula. Risk equals likelihood times impact, whereas the likelihood is measured by percentages and the impact is measured in dollars. When using this model, one must break down both of likelihood and impact into smaller pieces that could be quantified and tracked consistently. From this point forward, we will focus on breaking down the likelihood component. And by the end of this session, I will also address the impact, even though you will see that this is far less challenging. So we have our formula, which is great, but the formula doesn't really worth much if we don't have any data to fill it with, right? So what kind of data should we use in this model? We need to use any data available to us that will grant us closer look for grasping the entire risk landscape. Luckily for us, in this analysis, we are in the business of cybersecurity, which means almost every operation we care about is recorded and logged. I found this research from 6 years ago that says the following. The average enterprise has 347.56 terabytes of data. And in the past 6 years, the numbers grew even larger. So my point is that the challenge is not getting enough data to analyze, but to know how to do it successfully without getting lost in the sheer amounts of information. The way we do it is by setting some metrics we want to measure and classify the data according to them. The metrics we will use are supposed to break down the risk being impacted from any attack scenario. We want to use metrics that will help us to objectively assess every scenario and compare it against the rest. So the metrics we will use are vulnerability, exploitability, and compensating controls. Our goal is to put a number on each of those metrics for every scenario our data can detect. Let's go over them one by one and see what each of them stands for. And we will do that by using a little analogy. Let's imagine we have an asset we want to protect, like our apartment. And let's also say that we live in a building that has a front door. This door is protected by a system that asks for a 4-digit passcode to unlock the door. How vulnerable would you say we are to the scenario of someone entering the building and getting closer to our apartment? Now, to make things a little bit simpler, let's ignore the option of tenants sharing the passcode with other people. And let's just assume they are the only ones knowing the passcodes. Given that the passcode is 4-digit long, that sums up to 10,000 possible combinations. So I'll say we are not so vulnerable to this scenario. But what if our password system looks like this? In this case, a potential attacker could identify the digits of the passcode and dramatically narrow his set of options. The data about the worn password system was valuable for us because it informed us that we are far more vulnerable to the scenario than we originally thought. Thus far, we've established that the scenario is vulnerable. But should we do something about it? Think what you would have done in this case. Would you really act to replace the password system for the entire building with a new one? Some of you might would, but I guess most of you won't. I know I wouldn't. The reason is that I don't believe this scenario poses much risk to my apartment. I know I have a lock to my apartment and that I have a camera installed in every floor of the building. So I can accept the risk of someone entering the building. This is what we call a scenario with low exploitability level. We know there is a vulnerability in our defenses in the form of worn password. But we also know that we are well covered by other layers of defense, which dramatically reduces the risk to our assets. We won't always choose to act to remediate a vulnerability we find if we know this vulnerability could not be exploited against us. It's no secret that most organizations today can't keep up with fixing their vulnerabilities. And so they use a combination of tools to assess the exploitability of those vulnerabilities. Only the highly exploitable ones will get priority. And even in this case, the organization will struggle to keep up. But what about uncertainty? The issue with risk analysis is that we always have some amount of uncertainty, meaning there's always a chance we are missing something that will tilt our conclusions. To try to reduce some of the damage of this uncertainty, we use compensating controls. Those are various checkpoints, if you will. Checkpoints we can use to hedge the risk and avoid some of its impacts. In our previous example, I mentioned camera surveillance. The camera can't really prevent someone from breaking in, but they can help a lot with identifying the criminals post ante and retrieving some of the damage. The level of compensating controls we have in place is another factor that affects the risk of the scenario we try to assess. In real life, we use different tools to block, stall, or prevent different attacks from being executed in the network. To conclude, we want to examine every scenario by its vulnerability, its exploitability, and the level of compensating controls we have to prevent it. How do we use those metrics to improve our security posture? Let's talk about it a little bit. First, ask your security managers to show you the data about your assets, the assets that you care about. Security and IT departments in large enterprises manage a variety of tools that can produce those metrics, just to name a few. Vulnerability management systems can map vulnerabilities across the attack surface. Usually, you'll find people in your organization who are dedicated to operate those systems. These are the people you want to be aware of the importance of your assets. You want them to prioritize those assets higher than the rest. Your input as a business stakeholder is viable for those teams who manage vulnerabilities, since it gives context to their work and improves their impact on the risk posture of the entire organization. Another type of systems are breach and attack simulators. Those systems can test the exploitability level of multiple scenarios and see which of them pose the highest threat. Again, in the lack of business context, the people who run those tests will usually just create a generic test plan that will lean towards technology rather than business priority. Don't underestimate the power you have in bringing context to the discussion. Lastly, Security operation centers operate a variety of systems that serve as compensating controls for the case of an attack. Firewalls and endpoint security products are very common tools that could be found in any organization. Discuss with your security teams about the coverage those controls have over the assets that are important to you. By taking the data from these types of systems, we can build a comprehensive picture of vulnerability, exploitability, and compensating controls across the business. These three factors should comprise the likelihood element of the formula we introduced earlier. As for the impact element, this is really far less challenging. Since this element is basically the monetization aspect in the formula, it heavily relies on the assets. As we discussed in the first session, every asset is linked to a specific segment of the business, which is deriving directly from the financial reports. All you really need to do now is to ask your analyst what would be the cost of having a breach in each and every asset. Now, let me give you a hint. You don't really have to do this for each and every asset on its own. You can group them. You can group the assets in association to their business segment. There are many other shortcuts you can use to do this quickly, but in the end of the day, this is the only thing you really need to do in order to get the impact measurement and put a dollar sign inside the formula. In the end of the day, it is all about getting the right data and make an informed discussion around it. In the past 3 sessions, we created a rich common language that could facilitate this kind of discussion. Open your discussion by mapping the assets that are most important to your business. It doesn't matter if you are executive level, P&L level, or a senior manager. Every manager has some assets that are crucial to his line of business. Ask what are the biggest threats to those assets. Discuss which scenarios are most probable than the rest, and try to distinguish vulnerability from exploitability. Ask what compensating controls are in place to disrupt a potential attack on your assets. Now, we come to kind of the last slides, the last bits of this series. So I really want us to put everything together and ask the big question: how to manage security posture successfully and over time. To summarize this series, in the little time we've got left, I'd like to list a few tips. If there's anything I'd like you to take away from these sessions, is this. So listen closely. Lead a culture of security. Encourage every manager in your organization to know what are his or her critical assets and how well they are secured. If you are an executive or a board member, set KPIs for managers and hold them accountable for the risk level of their assets. Consult with your security managers and create an ongoing conversation around the data using the metrics we listed. And finally, promote cybersecurity efforts. Hire the right security managers who have the capacity and the capability of communicating risk to the entire organization. Invest in those managers and equip them with the right set of tools. High-quality people with the right tools are an investment that pays off.